Bun găsit la Zilele Aniversare Litera. Astăzi avem un interviu cu o doamnă doctor, psihologă, Nicole LePera. O să vorbim în engleză, dar această introducere a fost făcută în română pentru cei care se uită la noi. And now I'll switch to English. Hello, Nicole.
Hi, Nadine. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for having accepted my and our invitation. This is a very special occasion for us because we celebrate the Litera anniversary days. We turn 33. This is a Christic age. It's the age of Christ, and it's the age of certainties, changes, and also of miracles. And I'm saying that because we are here before Easter. Easter is happening in a few days. And I don't know if you celebrate Easter or not, but I just made this joke in order to set the stage for what we're going to talk about, meaning the discovery of ourselves. Your book, How to Do the Work, Recognize Your Patterns, Heal from Your Past, and Create Yourself, which in Romanian gave Cum să-ți transformi viața, descoperă tiparele de comportament, vindecă-te singur și fii propriul tău stăpân. There's a switch. It means in Romanian how to transform your life, to discover your patterns, your behavioral patterns, to heal yourself, and to become your own master, which is a bit different from the original title. You are a doctor, a psychologist, a holistic psychologist, and I would like us, with your will, to start from here. What is a holistic approach to psychology, and what is a holistic psychologist?
Well, I want to thank you for translating the title and the subtitle with me. I actually love hearing that word transformation is used, because that's what the work and working holistically, as far as I think at least, is all about. Quite literally transforming our full self. And the shift I made, and this was all through my practice. So I went to school, I got licensed in clinical psychology, I opened up a practice, and I was doing, I think, what people think of traditionally when you think of a psychologist. I would sit and talk and explore the struggles, the issues that my clients were having. And of course, the hope was to not only gain understanding so that they kind of could understand why the client was struggling in the way that they were, but also to provide tools for change. And what I saw very quickly, Nadine, in my practice, and I also saw this not only in my personal life, in the lives of all of my friends, everyone around me, is the number one complaint, if you will, that would come up in session weeks, months into my work with clients, and all my friends were pretty much saying the same thing, was I'm so stuck. I have all of this self-awareness. I know me, I know my patterns. I even know what I want to change, but I can't change. And for me, it was really disempowering, not only as a human who was struggling with anxiety, struggling with not feeling connected or fulfilled in my relationships and in my life, felt really disempowered as a therapist, the person who's supposed to help people change. So I really sought to understand why this approach wasn't working. And what I came to realize is we were leaving out a big aspect of our human existence, and that's our body. So to simply answer your question, what holistic means to me is really honoring the whole person who's not just a mind and thoughts, who's living in a body. And when we really address the whole person in that way, then we can transform.
I love this. And I love the fact that you criticized René Descartes. I always criticize him as well, because he separated the mind from the body. They are not separated. And we can feel that every day. If I were a blonde, 180 centimeters tall, I would be totally different. I would think differently. And my perception of myself and of reality and of everything existing around me would be totally different. I love the fact that your book contains a lot of practical exercises. It contains the theoretical part where you present the whole picture and the origins of our traumas. This is very important to talk about. And then the exercises, the practicality of it all, which is also very important. If you do the work, I love this, that your book is called How to Do the Work, because this is the thing we keep on talking about, but nobody's actually willing to do the work. What does it take to do the work? And what kind of work are you talking about here?
Yeah. So kind of honoring those two separate, I think, components of change. And like you were just describing, awareness, understanding where our patterns come from, why we're stuck, our trauma is part of the journey. And the reason it's part of the journey is a lot of us and a lot of my clients, a lot of people in my community feel really shameful. I mean, I don't know anyone listening. If you go to change and you can't change, or you can't keep up these new habits, and you know the way you're living isn't serving you, you start to wonder, is something wrong with me? You know, why can't I change? And so that level of understanding can be really healing. However, that second piece of the puzzle, okay, well, now I want to actually change. How do I do the work? How do I transform in my life? And that's those action steps that you're talking about, which is why it was so important for me to include those in my book, because we do want to now begin to change. And quite universally as humans, we don't want to change. Change feels very threatening, because anytime I do something new, what that's signaling to this deeper part of my mind called the subconscious is the uncertainty of the outcome of this new thing. And our subconscious is wired to keep us safe. We like to predict what comes next, even if what comes next doesn't serve us, because it's known. So when we talk about action steps to change, I talk about the fact that we'll meet what I call resistance. It'll be difficult to change. You'll have a million reasons why not to, and you'll probably feel uncomfortable doing these new practices. So I often talk about keeping a commitment of making small changes. And this is for all of us out there who try to change our lives from top to bottom between now and tomorrow. And again, understanding that anything new feels uncomfortable. I talk about the practice of keeping a commitment for small promises. Let's just practice doing one small new thing every day consistently until that small new thing becomes a habit, because that's what we're really looking to do. When we talk about transformation, we're talking about creating new habits, which are just behaviors that we now engage in consistently.
Is that true that it takes 21 days to create a new habit, or it's just an urban legend, let's call it this way?
It's interesting. And I'm happy you asked. There's a ton of different research out there, Nadine, whether it's 20 days, 30 days. Some researchers are even now able to map it on to changes in our brain. Verdicts out. We don't have an exact, in my belief, there's not an exact protocol. What's important to know, though, in my opinion, is that change is possible, whether it's 21 days, 50 days. My go-to is when you do this new thing more consistently than you don't, then you know you've now created a new habit. Again, what's important foundationally in our brain to understand is that you're transforming your brain. You actually are creating new networks in our mind, because that's what they're studying in these studies. Again, whether it's 21 days or 30 days, your brain is actually structurally changes. Again, this is why I love this idea of transformation. You're transforming your brain, and therefore you're transforming your whole experience.
And the body as well. The body follows, but also the body impacts the mind. Yes. And you were saying something that made me think of better the devil you know, because the subconscious always wants to keep the things known, the things that maybe hurt us, but which are known, therefore they are safe or perceived as safe. Let's talk about the big elephant in the room, which is trauma. It seems that everybody has traumas in the past, even if the childhood was okay, even if the parents did their best, they were loving, they were there, they were present. Yet, there's no perfect parent, there's no perfect childhood or perfect life. There is a trauma somewhere. How do we get in touch with it? Because the subconscious is always resisting this. How do we start from the body to the subconscious to the mind to reveal the trauma and then heal it through those new habits you were mentioning?
So trauma, really expanding this definition is such an important part of my work, because for a very long time, what I was taught, in my school programming, and of course it was backed by some research that happened in the 90s. And in the 90s, this very important study was conducted, and it was called the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. And what we learned at that time is that traumatic experiences that happen to us in childhood carry effects with us throughout life, not just in our emotional worlds, but also in our physical bodies. So I learned that. And again, the way trauma was defined in that study was trauma was a label applied to an event, meaning if an event passed a certain, threshold of distressing emotions, and usually what got categorized is passing that threshold are instances of abuse, physical, sexual, instances of extreme neglect, right? So at this time, for the first time, we realized that things that happened years ago still affect us. And this was huge news because a lot of us carry the belief that I'm not a kid anymore. What do you mean? I'm not in that environment. However, what it was leaving out was everyone else and other different types of trauma. And why this was confusing to me is because I didn't check any of those boxes. I didn't have any of those big moments of abuse or neglect in my life. Yet what I was seeing was similar coping patterns in myself as people, the many clients that I had who had many of those, as they call them, big T traumas. So what I really want to understand is why are so many of us struggling in the same ways if these big events didn't happen? And what I came to realize is that there are many different traumatizing moments that we have as children that sometimes, occur in our emotional worlds. If you have a parent who isn't emotionally attuned, who isn't available to help support you through the very overwhelming feelings of childhood, if that happens consistently enough, of course, this isn't the one-off where mom or dad was unavailable after a bad day at work. This was consistently unavailable, then that can be defined as trauma as well. So what I believe is important is taking the label off of the event and applying it to the individual's experience of the event. Meaning, if we don't have support, we don't have a parent to help us understand this overwhelming world of being human, things can traumatize us because we can feel that overwhelm. So how do you know? To answer your question, our body stores trauma. It never goes away. And usually how we know is because our nervous system, which is the main system in our body responsible for dealing with stress or threats or those overwhelming events, can become dysregulated. And there's certain ways when you begin to tune into your body, and again, why it's so important to include your body, you can begin to identify if you're living in a dysregulated nervous system. If you're always feeling on edge, if you're always waiting for the next shoe to drop, if you always feel like there's a threat around you, if you're like me, you're always detached, you're always kind of dissociated or not feeling really grounded in your experiences, usually those are markers that your nervous system is dysregulated. And again, all of this can happen early on, and our nervous system can remain dysregulated through life. So again, really important to begin to learn your body, to understand that your body does have different cues. We call them symptoms of this dysregulation. And the first one that comes to mind, and the experience I lived, was anxiety. For a very long time, we labeled anxiety as this genetic, right, imbalance in us. If you got this particular chip, you would have anxiety. And again, I've come to realize that the symptoms of anxiety really are the symptoms of this dysregulation in our nervous system, meaning they can be healed. There's certain things that we can do. If you do notice that you are suffering or living in this trauma cycle of dysregulation, again, possibly from our childhood, decades ago, to begin to balance our nervous system. Because again, to speak to the point you're beautifully making, the mind is communicating with the body and the body is communicating with the mind. So if we can start to send those messages that we're safe to our mind, then we're going to actually change our emotional experience.
What if the trauma is too deep or too difficult to access? Are there any exercises to make the subconscious feel safe in order to reveal the trauma and then see it and understand that we are not back in time when that happened? Yes. We are safe now. We are not the small child. I'll reach the topic of the inner child after this, because that's also very important and they are interconnected. But can we I don't know, I'm saying trick the subconscious, but maybe not trick the subconscious, convince the subconscious or seduce the subconscious into feeling safe.
100%. And just to clarify, we don't necessarily need to envision the trauma or to know in, I think, the way that we traditionally think of. And I'm a great example of this, because one of my coping mechanisms for overwhelm in childhood, not having an emotionally attuned parent, left me feeling chronically overwhelmed. So what I did to cope with that in my nervous system is I checked out. I went to live on what I call my spaceship. It's called dissociation, which just means disconnection. A symptom of that is you begin to, over time, realize that you don't have many memories. So I have very little memory. I can't really revisit and play the movie screen of the traumas of my childhood because they're not there. I mean, think about it logically. If you're not present to something, it's going to be really hard to remember it later. So again, to clarify, when I talk about bringing, or when we're talking about bringing the trauma up, we're not talking about, right, putting on the movie screen and reliving those really painful moments. We're talking about looking at how trauma is living in us now. And again, the way we know it's living in us now is we never feel safe. We might always feel disconnected, right? We look at the now moment, and then to seduce our subconscious, safety is what is so incredibly important. Because when we're overwhelmed, we don't feel safe. That's why I checked out. I found safety on my spaceship, right? So what we want to do now is teach our body that we are actually safe in this moment. Maybe my nervous system is reacting to that past moment, but that moment's not here right now. But my subconscious doesn't know that. So what I need to do is teach my body safety in that moment. And my number one go-to tool, because you can do it anytime, anywhere, no one even has to know you're doing it, is begin to teach your body how to breathe from your belly. And maybe listening, this sounds so easy, so simple. I know when I began to explore where my body breathes from naturally by just putting a hand on my chest and one on my belly, what I came to realize is I was always breathing really shallow or barely even visibly from my chest. And when you're breathing from your chest in that way, that's a stress response. Again, that's my body telling my mind that I have a reason to be stressed out. I need to be looking for the threat around me. So by teaching our body, and the way I taught myself was actually by laying down at first, because it was very difficult to learn how to breathe deeply and slowly and evenly from that belly. And then once you teach yourself how to do that, in that moment where you're feeling unsafe, giving yourself a couple deep, slow breaths from that belly will shift that signal that your body is telling your mind, and it will begin to tell your mind, wait a minute, you're actually safer than you thought.
Actually, I was doing this because I'm trying to suppress the cough. And it works. Because I was saying I'm a bit ill and I feel like coughing. But even the fact that you said that made me feel better. So thank you.
Absolutely. And with practice, then you can do that, right? When you're starting to feel yourself become stressed, become activated, when someone's saying something that's upsetting you and you don't want to react, all of this can happen in real time as that tool to shift again, that signal of I'm not safe to wait a minute, I'm safe. And when you shift that signal, now you can begin to make new choices.
So breathing is the first tool we have, which is very important, and it comes in handy at any time. And then the second one, just give me 5 tools just for everybody listening to us or watching us to use at any time during the day when they feel stressed or overwhelmed or tired or whatever, just to connect with themselves, with their own physicality.
So we have breathing, and that's 2-part, right? Notice where you're typically breathing, because that will give you information on whether or not you're stressed. And then to learn that there's many different types of breath work. I like the deep belly breath, again, because you can do that at any time. You don't even look like you're really doing anything. Another great way to calm your nervous system is to use your senses. What can you see in the present moment? What can you smell? What can you touch? What can you taste? Anytime we give our attention to how we're experiencing the senses, our sensory experience in that moment, I should say, we're present in that moment. And presence is so important, again, because usually when our nervous system is dysregulated, it's because we're stuck in that past cycle. So checking in, doing that simple, what can I smell? What can I touch? What can I taste? Another great tool, it's called grounding. Taking off your shoes, finding a place in earth, in nature. I know a lot of us, I lived in a city for a very long time. That might mean a little patch of grass in a park, might mean visiting with your plants. Anytime. So grounding, actually taking your shoes off and feeling your feet on the earth, fully paying attention, not lost in thought, fully paying attention to how that feels, grounding in that way. Grounding visually, looking at nature, being with the feeling of nature, the sound of the trees, the sun on your skin, feeling nature in a more visceral way will help you, again, get really present. So I think those are really, can I use my senses? Can I use my feet to actually ground myself? Can I use maybe the sun or the wind around me to tune in? Can I use my breathing? Some of us use music. Some of us, kind of put music on and really focus our attention on what it feels like to be listening to a piece of our favorite music at that time. What we're doing in all of these practices is we're teaching our attention how to be present here, because more often than not, at least, here is safe. The thoughts in our mind, the past experiences we had weren't safe and were overwhelming. Here is safe. And if we can learn how to teach our body how to be in each present moment, oftentimes we can shift that signal of I'm unsafe to I'm safer than I thought.
What if that here is not safe? Actually, what if somebody is sick? What if somebody has cancer or a relative died, or they are going through a very painful breakup, or they lost their job or something happens? And they don't want to get disconnected again during this moment, but they want to be in contact with their selves. And at the same time, they don't want to not feel safe. How do we deal with that? With the fact that sometimes here and now is not safe.
Right. And in the instances where it is possible to change our circumstances, right? That would be the first plan of action, because a lot of us on our healing journey do come to that realization. My relationship isn't safe. My environment isn't safe. And again, if we have the opportunity to change that, that's where we would want to change, put up boundaries, create distance, change your space. Of course, not all of the time can we change those external circumstances. Some of those are not changeable, or we don't have the means to change those circumstances. What's incredibly helpful in those moments is support, is having another human, having another nervous system that's maybe not in the same crisis that you're in to help you find safety. Because as a human, we are actually, I don't know if any listeners have heard this saying or how it even translates. Humans are referred to, or our nervous system is defined as wired to connect. Simply what that means is our nervous system in infancy needs another nervous system to find safety. That applies throughout life. And that's one of the biggest reasons, not only why I created the community of self-healers on my social media, what began on my Instagram account, why we created the Self-Healers Circle, to find that, which is now a global community in my self-healing membership of other humans that might provide that support, because we all need that support, especially if we're in a circumstance where we can't change what's happening. Oftentimes having someone even just to sit next to us, someone who's in a calmer nervous system state, can help us feel not alone, and a little bit actually our bodies, it can actually help our body feel a little more regulated.
That made me think of that scene in the Avatar movie when they connect their tails and they regulate their nervous systems.
Yes, 100%. And that's the thing, is we need other humans. A lot of times, when I talk about self-healing, I hear it being, the concept being misunderstood, that, what I'm talking about is we're on an island and I can do this alone. And Absolutely not. No human is on an island.
No man is an island. Yeah.
We're all connected to everyone else, and we actually need that connection. And like I said, in those moments of crisis, sometimes that can be the only thing that can help our bodies feeling safe. Having that loved one, having that supportive friend, having that new community member you met online, and having their safety in that moment might be what helps you then find your own safety.
Now, the inner child. We mentioned this before. That's very important. And there's a lot of talk about this, about the inner child, about reconnecting with the inner child, about staying the inner child for the rest of your life. And it's very interesting that you say in your book that the big protector of the inner child is the ego, which is the biggest obstacle in our lives, the obstacle between us and ourselves. How do we connect with the inner child? What is the inner child, and how do we overcome this obstacle of the ego? Because ego is present, and to some extent it is also useful. It's useful to have a bit of ego, not too much, but just to realize that you are worth it, that the inner child is worth it, and that you can connect with the inner child and heal her, let's say.
100%. So what the inner child is, and again, it applies across our life. So we can really, and I'm simplifying all this, we can really think of the inner child actually as a state of consciousness, right? Think of a child. A child is curious, has an imagination, right? Is immersed in whatever activity that they're doing. They're just fully there and fully present. And again, creative and imaginative, and just, they are who they are. However, often over time, that inner child is also very adaptive, meaning we learn, we're so attuned to that environment around us because we need to be, because we're so dependent on whatever caregivers that we have around us to literally meet our needs to keep us alive, that the only tool we have to cope is to fit in, to make sure that that caregiver keeps showing up. So the many of us, right, who grew up without the attuned caregiver, who maybe grew up in a traumatizing or abusive environment, can't leave, will learn to adapt, will begin to cope in certain ways, like me and my spaceship. All of that, again, even though that it happened for many of us decades prior, all of that is stored in our brain, and then becomes a very patterned relationship that we have across our life with things like our imagination, our intuition, our creativity, and how we react and cope with our emotions. So that inner child space is there. What happens is we become reactive and we cope in the same ways we coped in childhood. We maybe lose connection to our intuition because it wasn't safe to stay connected. We might squash our creativity because when we're in survival mode, or when our nervous system is in survival mode, like many of ours remains throughout life, creativity, imagination, that's not a priority. What's a priority is, again, sustaining life, dealing with that threat that we're perceiving in the moment. So it's important to understand as an adult, as many of us are who are listening, I'm sure, is that when we hear inner child, we all still have that space in our mind, the ability to connect with our intuition, the ability to be creative. I believe we're all creative beings as humans, the ability to imagine and the ability to regulate our emotions. A lot of us need to teach our inner child how. Again, through everything we've been talking about, through witnessing those moments where we're in that state of reactivity, and through at the same time, teaching ourselves that we're safe. Just like we were talking about, tuning into my nervous system is not feeling regulated. Can I teach my body safety? And the more consistently I practice that, the more I regain then access to things like my intuition and my creativity and my imagination, that inner child space in my mind.
What was the name of your spaceship, if I may ask?
I didn't actually, oddly enough, I didn't name my spaceship. I did name my ego. So how the ego wraps into all of this is, our ego really simply is the story we've created based on all of our life experiences about who we are. Again, oftentimes that story is very limited. That story is based on trauma. That story is based on the way we cope with who we are and how we've been. So that becomes our protector again, because to know myself differently, to know myself more fully, even though this doesn't sound logical, is unsafe to my subconscious. So we don't want to kill the ego. We do need it to some extent. What most of us want to do is learn how to witness it, learn when it's causing that reactivity or that disconnection. And again, using these same tools, how can I create safety now so that my ego doesn't have to be on alert? And so that in this moment, I can begin to make new choices that are not that reactive, that are not kicking and screaming and yelling and checking out like I learned to do as a child. And I very easily said all of those things, Nadine, because I do them, right? Now I can learn how to cope with my emotions in a new way. And this all happens again in real time when we involve our bodies and our nervous system, because our inner child and our ego are all connected again to our states of consciousness.
Fear is a very important word here. How do we control fear? Or maybe control is not the right word. How do we keep it safe? Actually, how do we learn to live with fear?
Yes.
Because we can't get rid of it. Anxiety stems from fear, which is deep rooted. But how do we make it easy or easier?
I love that. The way you shifted that question is, how do we learn, right? To teach ourselves that we can cope with fear.
Exactly.
That's
on
mainly
a daily basis.
Exactly. 100%.
Maybe it's not our friend, but it's not an enemy. It's just, you stay there, stay put. It's okay. I'll bring you water. I'll feed you, but not too much. And just let me be as well. So don't dominate me. I'm not going to kill you, but don't kill me either.
Exactly. And that's the relationship that we want to teach ourselves, because what most of us, the belief most of us have, again, from an consistently overwhelming experiences in our past, is that we can't cope. We're not safe. Things can happen and I really have no control over how I react and what I do next, because that's the lived experience we've had. Because again, we've shifted into our inner child. It's reacted the way it's always reacted. And we actually don't have that space. So what that has then done, so again, using me again, the more consistently I checked out on my spaceship, which was anytime I felt any fear, worry, anxiety, what I was teaching myself in not dealing with it by checking out from it was that I couldn't deal with it, right? I strengthened that belief that the only way I can cope with this fear is by checking out from it. And again, the more we repeat that, the more that belief really gets grounded in us. So what we're really doing is we're not stopping fear. We're not stopping scary or, uncertain things from happening. Actually, most of us, one of the aspects of being human that challenges most of us is the reality that we don't actually get to know what happens tomorrow. We don't even get to know what happens in the next 10 minutes. Our life is uncertain. So how can I continue to walk through all of the different degrees of fear I might experience on a daily basis? And again, that happens not when we remove the fear, again, because that continues to teach your subconscious that the only way you can deal with it is by removing it. You want to teach your subconscious emotional resilience. And what that simply means is I can tolerate being scared. Not again, I'm not going to dive into the deep end and do the scariest thing I can think of. I'm going to take small steps to, again, have my body and my nervous system become stressed because I'm a little bit scared. And then I'm going to maybe use my deep belly breathing and teach myself that I can be a little bit scared and I can retain control. I can regulate my body and become unscared. And then the more consistently I practice that, I'm developing that emotional resilience. Because again, emotional resilience means I can cope with the range of emotions. Not I avoid them, not I ignore them, not that they don't happen in my life because I've, sanctioned them out, that I can actually cope with different degrees of stress.
Yeah, so courage is not the lack of fear, but going on while being afraid.
Yes.
Why is it that sometimes it feels safer to hurt, to suffer? It's familiar. Yes. It's like, I don't want to break out of this cycle because that's all I know. Therefore, suffering becomes the safety. It's a paradox, but it happens so many times.
Outside of it being familiar, I mean, you spoke one of the very beautiful reasons is because sometimes that's our familiar, right? Not suffering, having a peaceful moment, having a positive feeling isn't what we're used to. And again, because our subconscious is really black and white about it, right? Familiar is safe, unfamiliar, and there's a big basket over there, is unsafe. And I think that's one of the major reasons, is because we're just not used to it. And the more we then practice a new emotional experience, the more we give ourselves the opportunity to get familiar with it. Another reason is, and this I think for a lot of us is hard to admit, and I had to really get honest with myself, we have, some of us, identities wrapped up in our suffering or in our struggle or in our illness or in our diagnosis. Some of us, and this applied to me, we have relationships wrapped up in our suffering and our, complaining or whatever it is that, we do around that suffering. And I saw this very clear in my life because we had a lot in my family of health-related anxiety and stress. That's, again, in absence of having an emotionally attuned environment around me, that became my point of connection. And I noticed I'd call my mom when I was suffering medically, physically, with illness, or anything, because that's how I learned to connect. So again, there's different reasons, I think, why suffering feels like home for a lot of us. And sometimes, like I said, it's our familiar. We have an identity wrapped up in it. Some of us might have relationships wrapped up in it. Some of us, it's who we think we are. And even entertaining the possibility that we are something beyond that is really scary.
Mm-hmm. You said something very important. Everything you say is important and top notch, but you said emotional resilience and how to gain it. But how do we gain emotional maturity? Because the emotional immaturity is the root cause of so many problems and so many dysfunctional relationships. And it's a perpetrator of the trauma and of this suffering that rings a bell and is familiar to us. How do we become emotionally mature? Are there any things we can learn?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reality of it is, Nadine, is a lot of us, even in adult bodies, are coping still in those emotionally immature ways. Again, the only ways maybe that we could in those childhood environments. And, emotional immaturity looks like reactivity when you hear something that you don't like, or when someone has an opinion that doesn't, mesh with yours. It looks like yelling and tantruming when you're upset. Upset is a normal part of life. The question is, how am I responding to it? And when we're really, really reactive, when we have no space for difference or for someone else's feelings or opinions or thoughts, of course, all within reason, not feelings, opinions, or thoughts or behaviors that are harming us. This is a different conversation. That's what emotional maturity looks like. And all of this happens with us when we learn how to regulate ourselves from the different emotional responses we can have. And for a lot of us, that means learning how to regulate our bodies in new ways, because until we learn a new way, our subconscious mind and our nervous system is going to rely on the tantruming, the yelling, the screaming, the icing, the, defending and tearing down people who you don't agree with. And again, all of this is within reason. Maturity looks like learning how to regulate my upset or the dislike that I have of what I'm hearing or the uncomfortable emotion that's coming up, and choosing, again, whatever a much more mature response would be, choosing to walk away, choosing to regulate yourself, choosing to agree to disagree, choosing to put up a boundary and take space when you need to. And again, none of this happens overnight. This is the gradual practice that actually ties together this conversation beautifully, which is becoming present to yourself as a holistic human, learning when you're dysregulated, learning and witnessing what you do, not shamefully, reminding yourself that you're doing this because that's all you could do. And then gifting yourself even the opportunity in those moments. And it doesn't happen in those moments. Sometimes it happens when we're practicing breath work leading up to those moments, so that when that moment happens, I remember now to breathe my way through it. And then gradually over time, what we are shaping ourselves into is an emotionally mature human. So again, there's not a one way. It's this whole process of, again, learning how to live in a connected way with my whole being and giving myself opportunity to make choices, not to rely on those old reactions. That's why we're stuck.
You said something which is relating to me. I mean, it's like the question for me. I have a very personal question now to make choices. What are some tools to make it easier for somebody like me or for somebody like other people in my situation who cannot choose easily? If you want to make me suffer, you make me choose. Sometimes between two very, very similar things or very similar outcomes, or it's very, very difficult to make a decision based on this. It's like, put me in a situation where I have to choose and I'm done, emotionally speaking. Why is this happening? And how can one find the tools, and what are the tools to cope with this?
A lot of us struggle to make decisions, and a lot of us outsource, right? We look to other people, we assess, we might even run our problems by our loved ones and, get a consensus of what we should do. And I too was once that person. I never really looked inside to figure out what I wanted. So sometimes we struggle with choice again, because we're just not connected when asked. And I had a really pivotal moment, similar conversation where I was needing to make a choice about how I would spend a holiday. And I was talking to a friend in particular, and I was feeling pulled in different directions because my family wanted me here. My wife at the time wanted me here. And my friend, after I went on and on for many minutes about all of these other people, she very calmly looked at me and said, okay, well, what do you want? And Nadine, I couldn't even answer. I had no idea. And for me, my difficulty in decision-making at that time not only came to light, I came to realize it's because I never actually stopped and asked myself. I always went first to how is this going to affect other people? What would other people do? I never actually hit pause. So some of us, again, aren't familiar with making our own choices because we always outsource. We always have that person we go to, or the people that we go to, or the expert that we go to. We don't actually hit pause and ask ourselves. And then another layer of difficulty, I think, happens. Of course, then the question is, well, how connected am I to myself? Am I connected to that deep space of inner knowing? I used this word earlier, intuition. A lot of us think intuition comes from our thinking mind, right? We're going to have a directive from our thoughts, and that's our intuition. Our intuition actually doesn't come in our thoughts at all, not in objective statements. It comes in feelings in our body. So we might struggle with decisions because, again, we're not connected to our body. We're not safe in our body. And that would mean building that foundation of safety through all of these nervous system tools we just talked about, so that when I have that moment to tune in, I'm actually tuning in to how I feel, right? Not what I'm thinking. And then a final complication, I think, happens say we are connected and we know what we think or what we feel, when we put so much pressure on decisions, on choices, when we have this idea that one wrong choice, right, can change the future of our life entirely. And of course, yes, choices impact us. I always remind myself, though, that while I can make a choice in this moment right here, right now, I have many other choices I can make in future moments. So again, I think some of us can relieve ourselves of this pressure. Yeah, maybe we do make a choice that's not ideal. We go down a path, right, that maybe isn't meant for us at this time. The more connected we are to ourselves and that intuition, the more I'll know. I might start walking along this path, this choice that I thought was meant for me, and I might determine that it's not. And then in that moment, usually more often than not, I have the opportunity to make a new choice. And again, a lot of us put so much pressure. We have this idea that every choice we make, and choices are powerful, again, don't get me wrong, but we have this idea that every choice we make has these long-term consequences that can't be changed. And maybe on certain very small instances, that's true. More often than not, though, I find that we put too much pressure on ourselves with choice. The more we stay connected to that intuition, the more we will always have an opportunity to reroute if we need to.
Well, if we are not Hamlet, to be or not to be, that's the ultimate choice. So that leads to something else. But you mentioned intuition, and that's very important. Is it better to follow the intuition, the first feeling, the gut feeling? Because sometimes it happens that you have this idea, you have this feeling, and then you start second guessing yourself. And then you don't know, you lose it. So you think, okay, first I thought this, and I thought that, and the reasoning started functioning very, very strongly. And now I have no idea what I thought in the first place. It happened to me many, many times since I was a child. For instance, when I was solving math problems, I had an intuition. I thought, okay, this is the path I should follow. And then the mind started second guessing itself and it all became a mess. Is the first thought, the gut feeling, always the best or the truest?
So again, we're shifting between feeling and thought. Usually that first feeling, right? That instinctual, that path that you saw and almost immediately kind of come upon you. That's the gut feeling. And then what we do, you described it very beautifully, is then we start to think about it. Yeah. Then we start to rationalize it. Then we start to view what we might think we want to do with maybe what other people would do in that situation. And then we confuse ourselves. And again, all of this takes practice. And again, you can probably notice those small moments, the more you're connected with yourself, of course. If you're lost in thought, if you're on your spaceship like I was, all of that early foundational work becomes incredibly important to give you then these moments. So I'm sure over time, a lot of listeners will, have those moments of instinct, right? Where I put this cup right here and I'm like, something tells me to move it. Right. And then I rationalize, I don't need to move it. It's fine. And then within 10 minutes, the cup's down, right? There's small moments throughout our day where that intuition pings us. And then more often than not, what happens is like you described it. We hear the ping and then we start to think about the ping. And then we start to find reasons why we shouldn't follow that ping. And again, all of this becomes more clear as we become more conscious of ourselves, as we become more aware of not only those feelings in our body over when our attention shifts and when it begins to then shift and get caught up in that rationalization. And most of us can argue away any ping that we have.
But sometimes it happens that we see the best solution and we don't choose it. Almost intentionally. We're sabotaging ourselves. Why?
So a lot of us, and again, based on our earliest experiences, feel unworthy, right? Based on accumulations of things that happened to us, experiences we had, ways we coped with it. A lot of us, our inner child, to bring this concept back in, has the most universal inner child belief that I think unifies most of us humans is that idea that we're not worthy in some way. That's why we had to adapt. Right. That's why I had to change who I was. That's why I had to wear a mask. That's why I had to, whatever it is you had to do or your inner child had to do, that the more you had to change yourself, just think about it again, logically, if you're consistently, subconsciously watching yourself change as a child, it's hard to believe that you're worthy as you are, because all you've showed yourself is all of these modifications and adaptations that you had to make to allow you to be worthy. So a lot of us sabotage ourselves, not only because it's our habit and pattern to do so, but because we really have that deep rooted belief that we're not worthy of that best path or of that outcome or of that life that we imagine that we want.
How can we change that? How can we love ourselves more?
Yeah, I think the first step is in the beginning, when I talked about healing and I mentioned the awareness piece of it, right? Becoming aware that a lot of our habits and patterns, or most of the reason we're stuck, again, is based in things that have happened to us and experiences that we had. When we really understand that, some of us then can have compassion, right? Can come to understand that we don't feel worthy, not because we're not worthy, but because of the experiences that we've had. And for some of us, that's the shift that allows us to begin to, over time, believe that we're worthy. Others, right? Practice can help. This is what, I don't know if any of your listeners have heard of the concept of an affirmation or a mantra, right? Even just simple as repeating, I am worthy. That's a thought, right? And the more we repeat a thought, the more I say to myself. So say I write on my Post-it note, I am worthy, and I put it all over my house. And every time I say it in my mind, or I repeat it aloud. The more I practice the thought, that's what a belief is. A belief is a practiced thought that's now backed by experience. So for those of you who are wondering or have heard of affirmations or mantras, or just thought they were woo-woo or spiritual, or I don't know what their really point is, it's because we're actually practicing new thoughts, which if you practice consistently enough over time, if you tell yourself you're worthy, a little bit, by a little bit, by a little bit, you'll begin to believe you're worthy.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. It's like compassion for yourself and love for yourself, which is very difficult to achieve, because sometimes we are very compassionate towards the others, or or towards the world in general, but not towards ourselves. Well, thank you so much for this lovely interview. I had plenty of questions left, like the pizza box. Maybe in a few words, you could tell us the story of the pizza box. And this is also linked to the fact that you said we tell ourselves a story, and sometimes the universe is echoing that story and is bringing a new message to us. There's this beautiful event in your book. Would you like to tell it? How you got the message from the universe on a pizza box, and what it represented to you?
Absolutely. So before the pizza box came along, when I was in my very early 20s, I was in New York City. I was in my training to become a psychologist. And I was walking to school one day, and I walked past the museum, and painted on the side of the museum was a quote. And the quote had something to do with this concept of life is lived in moments, this concept of a moment. And it struck me when I was walking by, and I love quotes. I always have. And I noticed that as that day went on, I kept thinking about this idea. So I went online and I started Googling at that time. And when I Googled the word moment, for some reason, it connected it, or not for some reason, because it's very based in the concept of mindfulness. So, and this was almost more than a decade ago, more than 15 years ago. Geez, time went fast. So very long ago, before mindfulness is kind of what it is today. It was very early on. There might've been a couple websites about it, and I got really interested in it. And the connection there is mindfulness is attention or presence in the current moment. And at that time, logically, I was like, this is big. There's something really important with this practice. I got my eye on you. However, I didn't practice it. It was just kind of an idea. And again, this all goes back to this idea of doing the work. A lot of us know these concepts. We've heard of ego. Now, even listening, you have an inner child. The question, though, is are you going to now practice, right, something new? And so for over a decade, I just knew the concept of mindfulness. I didn't really practice or apply it. And flash forward now, and I have the beautiful opportunity to write this book. And I was retelling the story, because now mindfulness, we can sub that word in with consciousness, which is, again, presence to the current moment, which is foundational in my work and in my book. And when I was writing the book, I was trying to remember the quote. And long story short, I couldn't figure out the words in the quote to, again, find it again on Google, until mid writing my book. I ordered pizza one night because I was exhausted, and pizza came to my door, and I pick up the pizza box, and believe it or not, on the side of, and I've never even seen a pizza box with quotes on it. On the side of that pizza box was word for word, I have chills thinking about it, was the quote that I was looking for. And so not only was that the universe, a signal that the universe was hearing me, that I'm not alone, that I am, and as we all are, connected to something greater, whether or not you believe in religion or not, that wired to connect really means we are part of something bigger, or a connection. So not only was that a message to me that I was connected to something beyond myself, it was, again, a reminder of that practice and of how foundationally important consciousness is. And that's what grounds all of this work. To become unstuck, we have to first see all of the different ways, again, that live in our nervous system, that live in our inner child, that live in these emotionally immature reactions, that we're stuck. And we can't do that unless we become conscious to ourselves. And all of that was delivered to me on a pizza box in Venice, California.
That's a beautiful metaphor, because the pizza was food for your body, and the quote was food for your thought, for your mind. So you hit both of them. So two tiny questions before we end the interview, unfortunately, because as I was saying, I would love to talk to you more. How do we change the story we tell ourselves? Is there a way to know it, first of all? Because sometimes we are wrapped up in that ego, and the ego doesn't let us see the true story. We keep on telling ourselves a story which is not the true one. And when we see the real story, how do we change it? If we have an aha moment when it's not okay. We don't like the story we're in. We don't like the story we've written so far. How do we change it? But first of all, how do we know it?
So consciousness, I love that this question came right after the pizza box, because consciousness gifts us with not only the possibility, we've explored all of the ways to be conscious to our body, the present moment, through our senses, through our breath, through grounding and the earth. Another aspect of consciousness is the ability to witness or see our thoughts. And that really kind of illustrates that separation, that we are indeed that conscious being that can see the fact that I'm thinking whatever I'm thinking right now, or hear it, or whatever language, resonates with me, to be aware of the thoughts in my head. And what happens when you learn how to, I call that self-witnessing, when you learn how to witness those thoughts in your head as that conscious being, more often than not, what we find is we're very repetitive. Our story doesn't change. We don't change the dialogue throughout the day. We tend to have themes. We tend to assign meanings. That's one of the gifts and the difficulties of our human brain, is it constantly seeks to make sense of what's happening around us. Again, all driven by our survival, because the quicker I can make sense of something, the quicker I can assess if this is safe or not, or for me or not, the more likely I am to continue on and to continue to survive. So what your mind or your brain out there, anyone listening, is doing all day long is making meaning. And again, it's not objective when it's making meaning. Usually the meanings that it makes are meanings that we've been assigning early in time. And what I witnessed, one of my common ego stories, one of the meanings that I assign to usually anything that happens around me, is I take the events in my life as evidence of how, the words that my mind uses, how not considered I am, how my needs don't matter in this moment. And again, all of this came back to those consistent moments in childhood where my needs didn't matter. They couldn't matter. My parents were in their own survival mode. They weren't ill-intentioned. They very much wanted to show up and love me and support me. They were locked in their own trauma, in their own fight or flight, where that was their primary concern. And what my childhood mind made sense of when mom wasn't available, when dad wasn't available, when there was a new crisis and, no one was there to tend to my bad day at school or whatever it might have been, what my childhood mind made sense of that was just that I'm not considered. So no surprises here as I began to view my mind. And that's to answer your question, learning how to become conscious, witness those thoughts, go see the stories you tell yourself for yourself. And that's exactly what I saw. I had a running narrative that my whole life was one evidence after another of how not considered I am. So how was I left to feel? You guessed it, not considered. If you tell yourself something enough, you will find evidence that that is true. We love to confirm the beliefs that we have. So again, the practice out of that is witnessing when you're getting hooked in those loops. While we can't stop the fact that my subconscious might continue to assign my partner not asking me if I wanted coffee as meanings that I'm not considered in that moment. My subconscious might offer that. I have a choice of how long I sit in that. Do I stew? Do I say, you know what, I'm not considered in this moment, and now I let that color my day? Or do I turn my attention away? Do I not get caught in that spiraled loop? And in this moment is a beautiful time to practice those new affirmations, to affirm to yourself that while you might believe you're not considered, that's not the case. I am considered. And now you can begin to practice. Again, it all goes back to the practicing of a new story.
And to the work. The work is the work word.
And to do it, because all of this just remains a thought, right? Listeners, you might know your story. It might just all be an idea until you do these practices. And then you will be able to change to such a degree that you will, again, going back full circle, transform yourself and your life.
So How to Transform Your Life by Dr. Nicole LePera. And one last question for now. Do you have a message for the Romanian readers of your beautiful book?
Absolutely.
For all the readers.
All the readers, Romania included. I just, sending my love, my compassion to all of you. It was such one of the gifts of going online many years ago, 3 years ago, when I first created that account, feeling really alone, knowing that I was on a journey, wanting to begin to experiment with talking about myself, my life, my journey, these new tools. I felt so alone. And really quickly, with the community and how quickly it expanded around the world to include the beautiful Romanian audience, I was met with how not alone I am. I was hearing from individuals around the world of, how similar we are more than dissimilar. So my message to everyone always is that reminder that there is so much that we share as humans, even if we look different, even if our environments are different, we're more alike than we are not. And we are right where we need to be. Some of us put so much pressure on ourselves, especially as you maybe begin to see other people and imagine they have a life that, you can't have. Really honoring yourself and your journey, because while we are universally alike, our journeys are quite individual to each of us. Our experiences are individual, the way we make sense of them, and the way we're going to heal is going to be on our own timeline. So my message is not only are we loved and we connected, I think as a global society, is that we're right where we need to be. And the choices that we're making in each of these moments are well more powerful than we give ourselves credit for.
So let's give praise to ourselves, but first let's do the work, or at least try. Thank you so much, Nicole, for this lovely interview and for having written this book. And we'll be waiting for you for your next book and for the next talk with you. Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your time and energy here today. Thank you for all you listening, and definitely stay tuned. I might have a fun new project in the works.
Well, thank you. By all means, we're here. Thank you. Bye-bye.